For the first hour, I want to cover something around mindset, strategy, and what I call managerialism, the philosophy of management that was invented, I suppose, towards the end of the 19th century when firms were growing up in the world that required very large numbers of men and women, mainly men in those days, often men who'd been taken off the land, relatively unskilled men, put in sheds in vast numbers to build quite complex objects like cars. And we needed a social technology that could control and coordinate the activities of large numbers of people in the pursuit of quite complex processes, and that was management. Before 1885, the average size of a company in the world was 4 people. So pretty much everyone knew the customer, everyone knew the owner, everyone knew their boss. It was a relatively simple world. And then you have a Henry Ford and others where you're in combinations of 20,000, 50,000, 100,000. And we needed some device to manage the collective, I guess, and that was called management. And I guess it's also true that management nowadays is long, long past its sell-by date. And we'll talk about the 6 pillars of managerialism and how each of them, I think, is shot. And the challenge for your generation, I think, is to remodel the organization to be far, far more effective, more humane, more human, and to draw upon not the motivation of men off the land, but people who have often more than 1 degree, hugely motivated to contribute to the world, enjoy working in teams, but find that it's very difficult to engage at work, and we know the engagement statistics are very poor at work because of these overweening hierarchical structures and bureaucratic processes that get in the way of effective human coordination. There's a real issue around this broken technology called management. Gary Hamel has pointed out that of all the technologies that have been with us for the last 140 years, management has changed less than any other. There's something profoundly wrong with management. Some of you may have seen his book, The Future of Management, where he tells the story of 3 remarkable companies that have reinvented management, W. L. Gore being the most interesting of the 3. And his recent book, which is, I think, a brilliant book, actually it's a better book. I think he was upset with the quality of The Future of Management. It's called What Matters Now. Have any of you seen What Matters Now by Gary Hamel? Wonderful book. And that is very much in this new tradition of trying to find ways of reinventing management or reinventing the organization to be far, far more creative, entrepreneurial, and productive. With the alumni yesterday, we were talking about one characteristic of senior managers, senior executives, in certainly most Western corporations today, what I would call the prevailing mood of corporations in the world today, indecisiveness, a pathological fear of doing anything, however small, that might go wrong or could be interpreted as an error, and how little happens in the world if people are terrified of taking the lead, of trying something out, of having an experimental mindset, of wanting to push the boundary, but wanting to play safe and wanting to be careful. So that's, if you like, the first hour, mindset, something around strategy, I think a provocative view of strategy, and something around managerialism, the dead hand of managerialism. And in the second hour, we'll look at something around performance, the management of performance, experimentation as one method of breaking through the indecisiveness of senior people in business nowadays. CEOs, I've noticed this recently, when CEOs leave office and they're asked, if you had your time again, what would you do differently? I suspect this is true of even prime ministers of Australia. Well, we saw one yesterday, didn't we, on the news? She's remarkable. They all say, I wish I'd been braver. I wish I'd done what I knew needed to be done, taken the consequences. I remember Tom Peters saying, we live our lives as though we want our epitaph, the gravestone, to read, he made budget. But when you leave work, when you leave your job and you retire, you want to look back on something more than making your numbers, don't you? Chris isn't here, by the way, because he's working on the budget. Can you imagine anything more absurd than a university worrying about budgeting? A meaningless activity. Very unscientific, because I was thinking about it with Alison, and we were watching Chris and everyone around him worrying about the budgets. If the world were predictable, in other words, if it were the same tomorrow, but a bit more so than it is today, then we wouldn't need budgeting. We just keep doing the same thing, but with more and more spirit, I guess. If the world is changing, then you do need to plan for it. But because we're not clairvoyant, you can't plan for it, because the world will always take us by surprise. So whether the world stays the same or whether it changes, in both cases, planning and budgeting are useless activities. They play to a particular self-deceitfulness that we think we are in control and we believe we need to be in control. Actually, Hayek, the economist, called socialism, if you remember, now we're talking about it, the fatal conceit, the belief that a small number of very clever people could plan an entire economy. But in a way, socialism, although we thought that socialism had died in 1989 when the wall came down, it's still alive and flourishing in most corporations in the world. They still believe in what the Politburo believed, that a small number of clever people can organize everything on behalf of everyone else. 4 or 5 thinkers, and the rest complying with various processes. Any thoughts? I mean, the so-called economic crisis is quite an interesting case in point, isn't it? Where we believe that huge risks were taken, disproportionate risks to the scale of not only the institution, but the economy of the world. And there we do feel let down by capitalism. And I'm not sure what the answer is there. I don't think... I was with a group of, we ran the first real ethical program in business we ran at in London Business School. We ran last week. There were 3 of us who felt we ought to engage with some of the professional service firms and investment banks in Britain. So we had McKinsey, PwC, Credit Suisse, UBS, and then 2 smaller asset management companies, Lansdowne and Jupiter, but very hot businesses. And 2 things, I don't think any of them really had a full explanation as to what went wrong, and therefore no one has changed their behavior as a consequence. I suppose our role was to try and offer something of an explanation, and certainly to try and draw the implications as to, I mean, you're very clever in this part of the world. You were either too daft to even get into the difficulty, or so clever that you saw it coming and skillfully avoided it. And it may be a subtle combination of the 2, of course. Yes. It could be risk aversion. But there is an appropriate, you see, if we make no mistakes, nothing happens. If we make too many mistakes, we go bankrupt or die. There is an optimal level of mistake making. Or rather, there is an optimal number and an optimal scale. And I think a good risk is a brave bet that if and when it goes wrong does not threaten everything. So it's contained in a small part of the organization or a small part of the nation. And that's what I mean by experimentation. It's trying out brave things that are played with in a relatively small part of the organization to see what happens. It's kind of suck it and see philosophy. By the way, it is the philosophy that created us as a species, sometimes called variation and selection, or chance and necessity, that, as Gary Hamel put it, if the evolution of species had operated with the Deming principle of right first time, we would all still be green slime. It's because nature takes risks that you get species. But it's interesting that even though we ourselves are the result of this risky process, we sit slightly sideways to actually using it in our own lives, skillfully. I mean, some people use it brilliantly skillfully, but too many people in capitalist enterprises that are paid to take these risks are not taking the appropriate risks. It's important to say that shareholders would like their managers to take greater risk with their money, but managers, in some sense, quite rationally, as the agents of the shareholders, are reluctant to put their career at risk for the shareholder. So the managers are the risk-averse element, not the shareholders. Depends what, I mean, risk is one way of calling it, isn't it? The other would be innovation, ingenuity, the human imagination at work. If we call it that, I think shareholders want to see that their money is in the hands of people who are permanently trying ways of discovering the truth, because a sophisticated human being recognizes that their behavior is based upon a large number of belief systems and assumptions that are flawed, that we are vulnerable creatures. It's what makes us the creature that we are. It's that we are comfortable knowing that we're vulnerable and fallible. And a rational person is someone who recognizes that most of what they do is mistaken or based upon some misconception. And therefore the rational person, I was very intrigued that the Pope, the new one, in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, was asked some quite complicated moral questions, typically about gay marriage, for example, or perhaps more complex questions around abortion. Do you know what his answer was?
Who am I to judge?
Who am I to judge? Now, when a pope says, who am I to judge, the world is clearly learning something. Brilliant answer. There's no dogmatic solution here. These do not have formulaic answers. These are deep questions around virtue and morality. There's no easy answer. We can all in this room argue for both sides of those issues, just as we can on any truly moral issue. There will always be various virtues clashing with one another. Isaiah Berlin believed that the world made a great mistake when we moved from pluralistic values, the Greek gods, each god standing for a particular virtue, towards a monotheistic religion where, so to speak, all the virtues were stated as though there was no conflict between the virtues. There is conflict between the virtues. That's what makes our lives moral, that every situation requires thinking it through from scratch. There are no recipes or hand-me-downs we could take to give us the answer. It requires thought and feeling. And that's maybe the great thing about the crisis. We don't know yet whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. My suspicion is that the world has grown up a bit over the last 5 years, and when we look back, we'll find, rather as we do in the two great world wars, they were also moments of tremendous innovation. In other words, human beings are particularly gifted when confronted by a challenge. This is a good thing about global warming. It'll make us better than we would be otherwise. When there are tough issues that extend beyond the individual, in other words, there's a collective implication, human beings pull together and do extraordinary things. And therefore my suspicion is that in 10 years' time, when we look back, we'll find that many, many extraordinary things happened between 2008 and 2013. The important thing about the crisis, I think, is that it began with moral idealism. There was a view, sometimes called the property-owning democracy. Under the Clinton presidency, it was felt that everyone had a right to own property, and the banks were cajoled into lending to those who couldn't pay the capital back. So it was done out of, so to speak, a kind of feeling of fairness, social justice, kindness of heart. But then the banks found that they had these very, very risky loans on their books, and they needed somehow to be packaged and disguised and traded. And these derivatives became so complicated to conceal the fact that there had been a generous attitude towards borrowers who would never be able to pay it back, that eventually it caused the crisis we saw. And like all things that go wrong in the world, it begins with the best of intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And whenever we see a good intention or an ideology, we should be very careful as to where this is going to lead us. Because in business we call it the importance of passion. Passion is wonderful, but passion can also conceal an inability to start to ask deeper questions about the assumptions upon which the intention is based. That's only one interpretation, by the way. It happens to be a rather right-wing interpretation as well. And of course, we talked about this last week, moral hypocrisy. We use many devices to cover up the tracks of our own sense of guilt. And we can easily tell stories to ourselves, if to no one else, to give the pretense that we're acting in good faith. One of the books that most excited me recently is a book by Alain de Botton, the young English philosopher, called Religion for Atheists. And he points out that in a secular society, we want to be careful we don't lose certain practices that all the great religions understood and that serves a phenomenal purpose, one of which is prayer. Prayer is a daily ritual where we have an inner conversation that reminds us that we could be better people than we are. And in the economic crisis, there weren't enough of those conversations going on. We better get to these slides, haven't we? It's pathetic. We're still on this opening slide. And we must allow the slides to determine the course of the conversation and not the other way around. So, bit around a mindset, the distinction between thinking and thoughting. Thinking is thinking for ourselves, doing our own thinking. Thoughting is not a word in the English language, of course. Thoughting is using other people's thoughts as the substance for our own thinking, sometimes called benchmarking. And it's very easy to slip into thoughting, isn't it? Management in some sense has become part of the fashion industry. If everyone else is outsourcing, then we better outsource. We are asked, when we come up with a solution in terms of a design for a program, for a customized program for a corporation, and it has quite daring elements, these experimental elements in it, the client will always ask, who else have you done this for? In other words, can I be confident that you know what you're doing? And our answer is no, we promise you. This is proprietary to you. It's not been tried on anybody else. I can absolutely assure you, we've not tried this out on anybody else, just to tease them. Because if it is tried out on somebody else, then already it's lost its economic value. The only things worth doing in life are the things doing for the first time. But business people like to know that they're in good company. Clearly, it's important to know the results of science or philosophy or what have you, but that'll never be sufficient to tell us what to do in a particular situation. And I'll come to that. I mean, all Porter's work anyway has been refuted, so it's not even, never was science. He had one insight, which was that the industry to which we belong has an influence on the potential profitability of the firm. Dick Rummelt showed that that is a profound misunderstanding of economics. By the way, it's still taught. The five forces is still taught outrageously, which is, if you like, academics going in for thoughting. It's easier to teach what I've always taught than to track whether it's truthful or not. Industry accounts for about 8% of the variation in the profitability amongst firms, so there's 92% still hanging free. And I'll talk about this if we have time at the end. The notion of cost leadership is a profound error. The article in the April issue of Harvard Business Review that studied 25,000 companies over a 40-year period could only find, I think, 2 companies out of those 25,000 that could be interpreted as having been successful as a result of a low cost base. Almost all the highly successful firms that they looked at had the highest cost base in the industry. Therefore, strategy is about increasing costs, not reducing costs. Cost cutting is one of the worst things you can do.
So race to the bottom.
Race to the bottom. Business is more like chess than cooking. Cooking has recipes. If you want to make scrambled eggs, you won't do better than use Escoffier's famous recipe. Even I can get to a reasonably decent dish of scrambled eggs following a recipe. There are no recipes in business, and we should never teach it as though there are. Business is more like chess, where practice makes perfect. If you want to learn how to play a good game of chess, you have to keep playing it. It's the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours rule. Play, 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 play. A book on how to play chess well, has lots and lots of games, half played, and typically at the bottom it will say 5 moves to mate, and you have to work out from the pattern of the pieces on the board which of the 5 moves to win. And you just do it again, and that's how I think in business schools we use case studies. At Harvard, 2,000 cases equals an MBA, 5 cases a day over 2 years, 2,000 cases. You get into a pattern of solving something situationally, skillfully, collectively. Practice makes perfect. I want to claim here that a recipe is, rather than profitable, let's call it useful, relevant, helpful, productive, universal. It applies for everyone, everywhere, at all times, and it's true. So Escoffier's recipe, it works just as well in Australia as in England. Gets to a good result, and it's true. It's based upon an understanding of eggs, things like that, and the human palate. But there's no such, this is the impossible triangle. I call it the impossible triangle. A business statement, a statement of how to be successful in business, cannot be true of all those three. Scientific statements are universal and true, the law of gravity, but it's useless. You can have a profitable universal idea about business, such as cut costs whenever possible. Unfortunately, it's false. Okay? Or you can have strategies in business, useful and true, but they're not universal. It'll work for you, but it won't work for anybody else. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but part of the mindset I'm trying to convey. Let's look at a few strategy ideas, and then we'll have another conversation. These are important ideas that strategy is not about aims, goals, targets. It's about how to achieve success, happiness, a life of friendship, whatever it is that we want. But by and large, human beings all want the same things. Saint-Exupéry, the great French aviator and the writer of the best children's story ever, I think, Le Petit Prince. What separates us is not our aims. They all come to the same thing, but our methods, which are the fruit of our varied reasoning. We all would prefer happiness to sadness. There are some exceptions. Masochists, for example, who would much prefer misery to joy. But it's a rare human being that would prefer misery to joy. Most of us would prefer a life of friendship to a life of loneliness. Most of us would prefer a life of wealth rather than poverty. It's the way we're made. All the visions I've ever seen of any business in the world always comes to the same thing. So clearly, strategy is not about deciding what we want from life. That's obvious. That's the way we're built, and indeed, that's what markets reward. It's how we become happy. By the way, what is the art of happiness? If you were to give me a recipe for being happy, what would you want to say to me? What would count as good advice?
Design and perspective. They say it's all about your expectations.
Set low expectations.
Well, there's an argument here.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't expect too much. Absolutely.
Have what you love and love what you have.
Yep. Love what you have is setting low expectations, right. The other raises hopes, in a way.
Contentment.
That's just to call it another name, isn't it? What's the art of contentment? Bill?
Pursue a passion.
Pursue a passion. We talked about this in the break. In Bill's case, follow a particular talent he had as a young boy, which was making music, and see where it takes you. I suppose the greatest philosopher of happiness, well, I suppose Epicurus was one philosopher of happiness. Dining together, delicious but simple food, nothing to excess. There was something in the Epicurean model about slowing down, appreciate the present moment, the love of friends. But John Stuart Mill, I guess, was the greatest philosopher of happiness, utilitarianism, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But he himself was not a particularly happy person until quite late in life. Sort of cobbler's shoes, I guess. The age of 8, because he was taught by his father. His father was writing this, I forget what the book was on, spent his life writing this book, James Mill, and he was teaching his son opposite. So as he was writing his magnum opus, young John opposite, as a very young child, was set tasks, and then the father would mark the child at the end of the day. So at the age of 8, he could speak and write perfect ancient Greek, Latin, and English. And by the age of 9, had read all the great literature of the world. You can see why he's such a miserable sod, can't you? But late in life, this is what he said. Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end, which is Bill's passion for music. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way. In other words, if you want to achieve your own happiness, focus on the happiness of others. Now that's only Mill's solution, sometimes called the oblique principle, that all the great goals in life can only be achieved indirectly. If you go too directly for them, they will somehow crumble in your hand. Edith Wharton, the great American novelist, said, if only we'd stop trying to be happy, we'd have a pretty good time. And I think the best of all, in a way, Viktor Frankl, his great book, Man's Search for Meaning, said, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. This is why budgeting is such a profoundly dangerous device. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. One of the chief executives I work with and most admire is Franck Ribot. He runs Danone, the French company that makes Evian water and Danone yogurts and I forget the baby food brand, Numico baby foods. And he's one of the wealthiest men in France. He owns a huge slice of Danone, which is now a global company, you all know it. And I heard him say to his board, they were challenging him in terms of what they developed, a competency profile system, another piece of managerialism, that people have to meet for a job, a particular competency profile. And he looked at this and he realized that if he were to apply to Danone, he'd never get any job anywhere in Danone. It's like Cambridge University showed the other day that if Darwin or Newton were to apply to Cambridge today, either as a student or a young lecturer, neither of them would be accepted. And he challenged them on the competency profile. And they said, well, we want people better than you, Frank. And of course, Frank was a bit hurt by this. Because these are young people, like, you know, young, yourselves, challenging this 60-year-old. And eventually he pushed back. He said, I think I've made a difference to this company. He was a wild young thing, the son of the founder. And his father had always assumed that he would never be the right man to run Danone. But that, in fact, is a brilliant businessman. And he explained his success to his board. I heard him say this in English, because English is now the official language of most large French companies, as you know. He said, the reason I made a good difference to this firm is that I couldn't care less. Now, what did he mean by that? I couldn't care less, which is a bit like this last statement, isn't it? You have to let it happen by not caring about it. What did Ribou mean when he said, I couldn't care less?
Without emotional investment.
Exactly. His own ego was not implicated in the decision. He wanted what was right for Danone. His own career, his own happiness, his own success was not part of the equation. His emotional investment, his ego, was not invested in the decision. But most managers will think of their own benefit first. And that's, in a sense, why we get the indecisiveness. Because we do care what happens to us as an individual. And in some sense, are rational to do so. Aristotle, this is not Aristotle Onassis. This is the other one. When we deliberate, it's about means, not ends. And yet in business, we worry about targets and milestones and KPIs and goals and vision statements and all of this stuff, when the trick surely is to concentrate on the method, the reasoning, the means, how to be happy, how to serve customers, how to beat competitors, whatever the issue is. Robert Simons, at Harvard, professor of accounting, wrote a wonderful book on strategy called The Seven. You don't often see books on strategy by accountants. He thinks there are 7 important questions to be asked. This is questions that need the answer how. What method? Who is your primary customer? How do your core values prioritize these 3 different classes of stakeholder? What are you measuring? What's the measure of success? What are you tracking as the core measure? What boundaries have you set? In other words, what profitable opportunity should be neglected because it doesn't fall within the boundary of the business you believe you're in? How are you generating creative tension? In other words, what context are you setting that allows people, or encourages people to take risks, to be imaginative, to see different ways of doing things, to think rather than to thought? How committed are your employees to helping one another, the cooperative spirit? Why have an organization in the first place rather than an open market if you don't have the cooperative mindset as the fundamental value of the organization? We're meant to be better together than apart. So how are you creating this cooperative mindset? And what strategic uncertainties keep you awake at night? Brilliant questions. So strategy, in a sense, is answering those questions skillfully with a how. Now, quick model of breakthrough thinking, which is the fundamental methodological element in the book on Uncommon Sense. It's going to be a Venn diagram. This is us. So let's say it's AGSM competing for MBA students, or it may be Danone competing for customers with Nestle. But it's a competitive market. So that's us. And that circle contains within it the entire belief system of the organization. So these are the assumptions that underpin the policies and practices of AGSM when building its MBA and recruiting its students and faculty and so on. So that's the AGSM belief system. Just to remind you, a belief is a testable proposition. It's either true or false. It's not a value. It's a statement about the world that is either true or false. And I've just listed some assumptions that I personally am very unsure are true, but which are very generally held, okay? And I've classified them in terms of whether these beliefs, whether we're aware of holding these beliefs or whether they're relatively subconscious, taken for granted, not sufficiently often made explicit. And beliefs that are deep, we'd find it very, very difficult to give up these beliefs. They, so to speak, define us as a person. Or relatively shallow. If we were provided a bit of evidence, we change our mind very easily. And you get beliefs like managers must manage, organizations are pyramids or hierarchies, you get what you measure, acquisitions create value, budgets guard against waste, share options are motivating, managers must be in control, great leaders need to be charismatic, People can be changed. Profit is the best measure of performance. Strategic plans drive innovation. Safety legislation saves lives. I think, you know, that at least you'd agree with me, they are hypotheses. Hamel's list is good. Top management is responsible for setting strategy. Getting better, faster is the way to win. IT creates competitive advantage. Being revolutionary is risky. We can merge our way to competitiveness. Innovation is the same thing as new products and new technology. Strategy is the easy part, implementation is the hard part. Change starts at the top. Our real problem is execution. Alignment is a virtue. Big companies can't innovate. Incumbents will always lose out to entrepreneurial startups, and you can't make innovation a capability. He thinks those are the great accepted assumptions that he believes to be profoundly mistaken. I think it's someone yesterday when I read those out, this is rather a different presentation, but I did read those out. Someone said, God, Jules, you make the world seem very pessimistic. I don't think it's pessimistic to recognize that we hold some views that are flawed. I think it's actually quite an optimistic view that there's a huge upside to recognizing that these are mistakes and to have the responsibility for fashioning them into something that's a bit truer of the world we live in and deriving the fun of seeing these new beliefs come true, so to speak. But our competitors have a different model of the world. There'll be a lot of overlap, but there will be some beliefs that they believe to be true that we believe to be false, and there'll be some beliefs that we believe to be true and that they believe to be false. Imagine if AGSM, and who's your biggest competitor? I mean, as an MBA school in Australia? Melbourne. Imagine if Melbourne and AGSM swap their strategic plans for their future. And in AGSM, you're looking through the Melbourne strategic plan as to how they want to win against you. And you put a tick against all the things they're doing which you believe to be wise and sensible and rational. And you put a cross against the things where you believe that they're profoundly mistaken, foolish, childish. Their strategy is the crosses you put on their plan, because the ticks cancel out. When you put a tick, you say that's what we're doing as well in AGSM, and vice versa. So the interesting beliefs are the ones that we believe to be true and they believe to be false. They put a cross on. That's our strategy. This cancels out. All the things we have in common cancel out. The way we do our accounting, for example. If the budgeting is done the same way, if we outsource in the same way, if we use the same criteria for defining the best student or the best professor, if all of this is similar, we're not creating any value for the world. We're cancelling one another out. We're defeating the whole purpose of a competitive marketplace. Peter. Yeah, that's a very important point, that we hold the same beliefs, but either we or they can implement these beliefs more skillfully. Now, all I'd say is you push the bar back. I'd say that successful execution is based upon some model of the world that is truer than those who execute less well. In other words, the ability to execute is also based upon a belief system, some belief that we hold about execution that's unique to us, that they believe to be flawed, but which is actually true. So execution might be, a model of execution might, yes, I know a model of execution that I think's true actually. You should always execute before you strategize. In other words, we should always act before we think. Now, extroverts understand this. And most of you, 2/3 of you in this group will be extroverts. But the introverts in the group find it very difficult to understand. The introverts will only speak when they've worked out what it is that they think. That's why introverts never speak, because they never get to work it out, because the extroverts are speaking so much that there's no time to think it clearly through on your own part. The extrovert will start the sentence not knowing where it's going to end up, But as they talk, they find what it is that they believe. That's doing in order to think. Whereas introverts have to think in order to do. Now, I think it's the same in business. It's the theory of experimentation. Try lots of things out. We don't know what will work and what won't work. The things that deliver give us the theory we need then to hold as a thought. But if you start with thought, you'll never get to action. Now, I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but that would be, if you like, an underpinning belief system around execution. One side of it is more true than the other. There's a very nice, let me read you this, because I think it's a wonderful story. This is the Aristotelian notion of the development of a practical skill. He's talking about the skill of being courageous. In fact, I've just read, the May issue of HBR I was reading upstairs has a similar logic here. But it could be around being a leader. Matthew Paris is a journalist on the Times, a very, very thoughtful person. He wrote his autobiography. He grew up in Zimbabwe. And this is just an extract for when he was a small boy. He says there was another incident. It was in the night, a cold night in our dormitory. He went away to school. And baboons were barking in the dark forest beyond. Awake, I heard Bill Compton, the toughest of us, say that he wanted to be sick. "We'll go to the toilets then," called Frank Kramer. "Would anyone come with me?" asked Bill. The truth, we knew, was that he was scared to go alone. After lights out, everyone was scared of the dark outside on the way to the ablution block. The generator was switched off at 10:15, and there were no lights, although we had torches. Nobody volunteered. "Please," said Bill, his voice faltering in an uncharacteristic way. And I remember so clearly, not just my decision, but the act of coming to it. "All right, Matthew, you aren't really scared of the dark, are you?" I thought, this is your chance. The others are more scared than you are, all these boys who think of themselves as being so tough. This is a chance to show them. Take it. "I don't want to go on my own," repeated Bill. To myself, I thought that as I was hesitant about going, the best way to make it happen would be simply to say the words, "I'll go with you," and then there would be no backing out. "I'll go with you," I said. There was no backing out. I hadn't naturally sprung to Bill Compton's aid, but made a calculation and then acted upon it. And as soon as I was out of my bed, holding the torch and walking outside, it was easy. He was very sick. I waited, not in the least scared now, and then we walked back. But before we did, while we were still in the toilets, so that he couldn't be heard by the others, he said, and these were his exact 6 words, "You were brave that time, Matthew." This made me proud. I lay in the dark, repeating the words silently to myself. In the years that followed, they had been repeated 1,000 times. Many, many years later, he was a Fulbright scholar to Yale, I saw on a professor's desk at Yale a translation of Aristotle from the ancient Greek. It is by acting bravely that we become brave. This put into words an idea whose core had appeared to me in the ablution block with Bill. If a desired human quality does not seem to be coming naturally, then the answer may be to stop fretting about how we might get it, and instead ask what things we would do if we already had it, and then do them. Now that's, I think, the story of leadership as well. We can teach leadership till the cows come home, but in some situations, we can all in this class recognize what a leader would do in that situation. And then the issue is, do I want to be that person? Shall I be that person? Shall I pretend to be a leader? And if you pull a face, eventually it will stick. You keep acting how a leader would act, and one day people start to say, you're a natural leader. But it wasn't natural. There's nothing in our genes that made us a leader. There may have been something in our upbringing that supported us to want to become a leader, but the act of becoming a leader is still a kind of hypocrisy. Let me pretend to be a leader, or let me pretend to be loving, or let me pretend to be kind, or let me pretend to be any other virtue out there. I had to give a commemoration address a couple of weeks ago in London to a group of students. And these were students of coaching. And I tried to argue that the worst question you could, coaches only ask questions, they don't give advice. The worst question would be a question such as, what are your feelings telling you? Or what have you got a mind to do in this situation? Or what were you put on this earth to do? Those are all questions assuming self-expression, that we were born to be a certain person and the seed is simply now flowering. And I said, the good question is, what would a kind person do in this situation? And by implication, therefore, be that person. Or what would a brave person do? Or a decisive person? Or a leader? We can all become the person we want to be. It's just a question of imagination. What would that property look like if manifested in a person? And willpower. Like Matthew. Do I just say it and then I'm implicated? I've got to do it. But we have so many excuses as individuals for not being the person we could be. So we fall short. The middle area is vast, isn't it? Why is it so big? Why do we share the same beliefs as our competitors? Most of them. Or do you think we don't share very many? Same markets. We're serving the same customers, reading the same market research reports, reading the same newspapers, watching the same news, living in the same world. It would be amazing if we each came up with a completely different, non-overlapping view of life. So we should not be alarmed that there's this huge overlap. We are reasonably rational creatures. We come to a view that serves us well and therefore must to some extent be based upon the truth. But there will be these funny things that make us the person we are. In a sense, that's the interesting part about each of us, is the stuff we persist in enacting that others wouldn't, the things that set us apart. Warren Buffett describes he calls it the institutional imperative, the way we all imitate one another, which exaggerates still further the overlap area. The behavior of our competitors, other companies, whether they're expanding or acquiring or setting executive compensation or whatever, will be mindlessly imitated. We are an imitative species, aren't we? We get comfort from adopting the solutions of others. So we exaggerate, I think, the huge overlap area, but there will still be quite interesting bits and pieces, okay? The trouble is, we don't know which of these beliefs are true or false. So let's draw a line. Actually, the line, drawing at an angle like this suggests that it could be anywhere. It'd be better if I'd have drawn it simply across like this. If most of our beliefs are true, then the line would be here. Most of our beliefs are false, the line would be up here, okay? But all the beliefs below the line are flawed in some way. All the beliefs above the line are true. The trouble is we don't know which of our beliefs are flawed and which are true. But think of this bit. This is quite interesting, isn't it? These are the beliefs that we think are true and our competitor thinks are false, and they're true. That's the basis of our success, right? So I call that uncommon sense. And every business, every individual will have some uncommon sense. Sense because it's true, uncommon because it's uniquely ours, or not many others have it. But there's an awful lot of common sense, stuff that's true, but everyone knows it. And there's even more common nonsense. We all share it and it's all wrong. The technical word for that is bullshit. Okay? And then we've got our own unique brand of bullshit down here. Only we believe this particular variety of crap. there are two things happening. Eventually, the truth is discovered by everyone. So this line is permanently moving down as more and more is discovered, okay? And they're discovering more of our good stuff, and we're discovering more of their good stuff. But the world is changing. What was once true in a business, not like science, may now be flawed in some way. So there's an upward pressure. If we do nothing, the line will gradually rise, and more of our beliefs will be flawed, okay? But that's an interesting point. Anyone seen Moneyball, the film? This is the best worked through visual example of uncommon sense in action. Do you remember the character played by Brad Pitt, Billy Bean? He saw baseball in a different way, what it took to win, do you remember? I can't remember the skill of the players that he particularly admired, and the other skills that other people admired that he didn't think were particularly special. But as a result of analysis and insight and seeing the world, seeing the game of baseball differently, he formed a completely different set of prices for talent. In other words, he priced baseball, young baseball talent or aging baseball talent differently from scouts and others in the other main baseball teams in the American League. And as a result, he was able to assemble a team that he didn't pay very much for, but which had the skills that he believed would win baseball games. And it was true, he did. The Oakland Athletics, because it's a true story, have won a longer sequence of wins than any other baseball team in the history of the league. Everyone adopts it now. The Red Sox were the first, I think, to adopt it. The Premiership in England now, I suspect in Australia it's adopted. The British cyclists, the French believed that the English were cheating. Do you remember in the Olympics when all the gold medals went to the English cyclists and the Tour de France? They thought the English were cycling, they were cheating.
What about Lance Armstrong?
Yeah. If you got Lance Armstrong, you think about this. And the answer from the English, yes, we've got round wheels. Do you remember that? But it was based upon science. Peter Keane spent 20 years studying it. Fitness, diet, the machine itself, how you design a bicycle. And he made these tiny differences, a fraction of 1% on each of these elements, but together. Now that's uncommon sense. He knew something no one. When Arsene Wenger took over Arsenal, whenever it was, 20, 25 years ago, it was based upon a completely idiosyncratic view as to how to win at football. But in a sense, he taught the English league how to play better football. If you remember, football in my day was a horrendous game in England. It was a dreadful game, dreadful game, played badly. Wrong boots, wrong ball, wrong field, mud. Ultimately, the value flows through to society at large. This is the beauty of capitalism. If there's competition, the games keeps coming up. I mean, you've got hold of this intellectual property for a tiny fraction of time. And that's why we admire capitalism. The profits flow through to customers in the form of better products at lower prices. You can't prevent it flowing back out into the market. It's called Schumpeter called it the gale of creative destruction. The only difference I would say, and I'm by no means the first to say this either, but it's a difference of belief system rather than a difference of target. If you look at the plans of most firms, they're differentiated in terms of what we want to achieve. So you create these imaginary numbers out there in the future, okay? But there's still the question, okay, if that's what we want to become, how do we get there? And the implicit idea is work harder, follow my instructions, and spend longer hours doing it. Whereas I'm saying, don't concentrate on the numbers as to what defines success. Concentrate on discovering something about the world, about human behavior, for example. Discover something about the world that is unique and true to you, that then can be used to create value without very much effort. The beauty of strategy is that it allows us to lead a lazy life, doing lots and lots of other things. Whereas the horror of planning, they keep giving you targets to meet that can only be met, if you don't have uncommon sense, with harder and harder work and more emails and more processes and more compliance. It's the life of a dog. If you do strategy well, you never need to worry about cost again. You never need to worry about staying late at work. Yeah, this was the question from the alumni yesterday. And even though I've had a night to think about it, I'm not sure I got the answer. It's a moral adjustment, I think, the recognition that we're flawed creatures, original sin, if you like, that the natural state of man is to be in possession of misconceptions. And all we need to do, so to speak, is to recognize our own fallibility, and therefore to notice particularly an idea that is informing the decisions we make that could be misconceived, and therefore ensuring that we discuss it more, we surface it, we identify the belief. See, I think a plan, I think a very good idea in any, are you all part-time MBAs or are you full-time MBAs? You're mixed, okay. I think firms should have a moratorium on any numbers in plans. Go for 1 year without numbers, just ideas and insights, the belief system. It'd be very interesting. It would create a proper strategic conversation. If you have to discuss your uncommon sense, what it is that you believe to be true that others believe to be false, which is the lead indicator of profitability. So use the planning system to have discussions about ideas rather than simply rehearse the targets one more time. A target, we know scientifically anyway that if you set a target, it corrupts the achievement of the task. I don't know whether you've read Dan Pink's book, Drive, which is about the theory of motivation. Say again?
It's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
In a way, yes. Measure it and,
It'll change the measure.
yeah, exactly. Anything other than a banal or routine, boring task, anything that requires a measure of creativity, if you put two teams to solve the problem, one has a huge financial incentive to solve it fast, and the other team has no incentive at all other than just do the best you can. The do the best you can will always, invariably beat the one with the financial incentive. The financial incentive interferes with the brain. Do you know Tim Galway's books, wonderful books, The Inner Game of Tennis and The Inner Game of Golf and The Inner Game of Work? He was a brilliant tennis player himself. I think he was Arthur Ashe's coach, and then he coached the US Davis Cup team in the great years in the 80s when they cleaned the board. We have two minds. We have the educated mind that worries. It knows how the shot should be played. You know, keep your arms straight, stand to one side, move as you move forward. When you're hitting the ball, moving forward keep your arms straight. Remember the right grip, okay? That's the educated mind. Mind number two can play the shot because it's played it in the past. You've played many games of tennis. The art of playing tennis well, therefore, is to switch off the educated mind, the worrying mind, the mind that's got all that back chat. Remember how to serve? Bounce the ball 3 times, you bounced it 4 times. You got the wrong grip, whatever it is. That interfering mind gets in the way. So for Galway, the art, not just in sport but in life, is to distract the worrying mind by encouraging it to look for particular things out in the world that will somehow distract it. So he took a group of AT&T call center telephonists who were getting a terrible reputation for rudeness on the phone. And they were bored, they were not well looked after, they were not well paid, they were poorly led, and they became demoralized, and it came through on the telephone conversations, and customers would complain. And he asked them, he said, when the next call comes through, try to imagine, on the basis of the voice on the other end of the phone, what they look like, what age they might be. Are they nice looking or not so nice looking? What kind of hairstyle? And the politeness shot up. Isn't that interesting? In a way, yes. We know how to be nice, we know how to be clever, we know how to be wise, but we have to distract that worrying, educated side of the mind to concentrate on something else. But most of us in life are still worrying, so to speak, even though we can do it. We can speak in public. We can speak in public. When we're with friends in a bar, we speak beautifully, we're articulate, we're wise, we're funny. As soon as we stand up to talk to a group, the mind goes blank. So how do you tame that worrying, neurotic side, you know? Let me just finish this and then. So all economic value comes from 4 tactical moves by the organization. You can either discover new insights, new uncommon sense, or you can discard some of this unique proprietary nonsense. Or you can steal from your competitors the wisdom and neutralize their advantage, turn their uncommon sense into common sense. Or you can park some of this bullshit with them because you've seen the truth, you've seen the light at last, okay? So all the things that make the world a better place are one of those 4. Courage to do things differently. Yes, this is essentially Hamill, 4 sources of discovery, 4 things we need to attend to see the uncommon sense. There are either some beliefs that are not challenged, that the industry holds, challenging what the industry takes for granted. There are some trends in the world. You know, the future has already arrived, but it's unevenly distributed. So look for those parts of the world that represent the future and catch up with it, underappreciated trends, amplifying weak signals, noticing what no one else has seen. Or there are capabilities that the firm has that haven't yet found expression. So you're looking for things we can do that could be harnessed behind other products and services, perhaps in other markets, defining our organization by what it knows, not simply what it does, and the unarticulated needs of customers. Customers are wanting things they're currently not getting, recognizing moments of truth in the customer's experience of you. So those are some of the sources of uncommon sense. Half-truths, this is Pfeffer's idea as to where some of the common nonsense might be in life, in business in particular. And he has 6. This is a wonderful book, by the way. Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense. Most of it is about the half-truths. They may once have been true, but now these beliefs are seriously in jeopardy of being very, very misleading and harmful to the organization. And he's got 6 of them. When we go to work, behaving as though it's work and not simply life. So we wear strange clothes to work and we behave in an exceptionally controlled and controlling way rather than a natural way. We work with our colleagues at work in a very different way than we would with our friends. The belief that the best companies have the best people. As a professor at Stanford, he'd always assumed that this was true, that the best companies outperform other companies because they have better people. But when he, as a psychologist, researched this, he found there was no evidence for that at all. On the contrary, what he found was that ordinary people working in extraordinary organizations will invariably outperform extraordinary people working in ordinary organizations. And therefore the challenge for us is to design the context, the organizational context in which, so to speak, normal people like us can do abnormally gifted things. Yes, I would say that one, what Linda Grattan sometimes called hotspots. We all know when we're at our best. We all know at work those moments when amazing things get done, and it's trying to recreate, it's trying to recognize what was happening. It's often when we're in a team that gels. It's often when we've been given a high degree of freedom to determine the solution. We're not fitting it to somebody else's notion. We're doing this creative work ourselves with the team. It's when we're operating to our skills, so we're expressing our own mastery, doing something difficult well that very few other people in the world can do quite as well, and where it's serving a purpose that's nobler than simply the bottom line of the organization we're working for. So those would be some of the elements that bring the best out in human beings. This is, again, Pfeffer. Monetary targets and financial incentives are extremely harmful to enterprise and capitalism. Again, planning is an obstacle to performance. It's an old-fashioned socialist idea that a few intellectuals can do the thinking on other people's behalf. This little elitist group that give themselves the right to make all the critical decisions. I'll show some examples of democracy in action or internal markets in a moment that is a counterfactual there. Change is difficult because human beings resist change. Again, Pfeffer found very, very little evidence for this. We will give ourselves permission to change if it's in our own interest. We can't change other people, but we can certainly change ourselves. And effective leaders are those that believe that they need to be in control of their companies. But this controlling element is precisely the element that disables good people from doing well. I think that's quite interesting. I've expressed them slightly differently here. In a sense, the fateful maxims, the rules for failure, if we could call it that. 6 rules for failure. Leave your emotions at the door. Recruit the best people you can. Use money to motivate your people. Count on your plans to deliver your goals. Recognize that change takes a long time. Act as though you're in control. That's a good question. Yeah, you spotted the weakness, I think. I have to be very careful here. Of course we want good people. This is a rather narrow view on the CV and the qualification earned often years before. With my French clients, even if they're in their 50s and 60s, I'm told before they arrive at the school that 2 or 3 of them were educated at the Polytechnique, and I should be particularly respectful of them. That was 40 years ago. What the fuck is that about? But then the French are elitist, and they do believe the thing that you did between the ages of 18 and 21, matters more than anything else. And they promote on the basis of that. So it's, in a sense, this is about the wrong criteria. Of course we want the best people, but the best people on the criteria that make a difference, that matter, the skillfully judged. Enterprise, enthusiasm, likability. One company we're interested in Britain is a company called Happy Computers. They keep winning all these prizes, and they have a model of management. The founder, Henry, has defined management as the art of making other people feel good about themselves. So how does he recruit? He says we don't need to know their CV, we don't need to know their qualifications, we don't need to know what they've done at other stages of their life. We bring them in, we give them a managerial task, and at the end of the week, we ask one another, did he or she make us feel better about ourselves? And if the answer is yes, we recruit them. My suspicion is that they're not attracting necessarily the people that really have those skills. They bump into a few that have something of those skills, but they're reducing the pool of talent from which they're choosing those particular skills too much. And therefore, how would you find in the overall population those that are particularly gifted at making others feel good about themselves? How would you recognize them in the street? How would you describe them? How would they like to be described? What can you say about your company that would have a disproportional effect of encouraging them to apply? It's a very good question. I remember with Unilever, because I used to look after the Lever Brothers account at J. Walter Thompson when I was young, and I got involved in a discussion with the senior people in Unilever. How do we recruit university students? And I said, let's run an experiment next year. You recruit half the students that you did last year, but you invite each of those students to bring along a mate. Because at university, we all know who the best kids are in terms of working for a firm like Unilever. I knew at Oxford, in my college, I knew exactly who was going to go far in which kind of line of work. So if Unilever had said to me, Jules, who should we choose in your college? Or when I was a teacher at LBS, I knew who the brilliant students were. I could have spent 2 years with them. Far more than any interview from Unilever would ever guess. So I was saying to them, choose one student, let's say from, I don't know, King's College London, and they bring one more that they think would do brilliantly at Lever Brothers. Your salary at the end of 5 years will be determined on the success of the person you bring in. Exactly, yeah. They said it's too risky. I said, where's the risk? Try it out, see what would happen. How conservative business is. It's such a simple experiment. Also, it's very flattering of the people you recruit. Bring a friend. Well, it's not quite a friend. Bring someone else to the college that you could persuade to come with you, knowing that your future salary is determined on the skill of your employment choice. No. Nothing I ever suggest goes ahead. Yes, I think there are McKinsey, for example, I'm sure it's apocryphal, but it's a nice thought. It's a fireable offence in McKinsey if at a wonderful party you happen to bump into another adult human being whom you wished worked with you at McKinsey. It's a fireable offence if you don't appoint him on the spot. What I like about McKinsey, they don't recruit people to fill a slot. They recruit gifted people whenever they bump into them, and that person will create their own slot. That's what they mean by giftedness. Managerialism. Let me just show you this, because I think this is interesting. This is obviously in innovation, it's not just around products and services or processes, operations. There are innovations around the business model. You know, what customers we serve, with what distinctive service offering or product offering. And above that, you can you can radically change or bankrupt the industry as a whole in the way that iTunes did to the music industry, the music recording industry. Or the most interesting one is management innovation, changing the way we work together, changing the design of organizations. This is what I'm concerned with here. And when we're thinking about management innovation, it can be these things: how we hold meetings, how we measure performance, how we use email, how we find talent, how we develop leaders, how we make decisions. It's a ton of stuff. So reinventing it, you know, the original problem in the 19th century was how do we, the higher ups, the elite, get more output, productivity from that's almost like the relationship to a slave or an indentured servant, our people. Horrible question. And the answer to that question is the following 6 things. Unity of purpose, all pointing in the same way, strong alignment, all there to serve the same God-given purpose. Specialization of task or division of labor, slice up the work package into one person-sized pieces called jobs. Standardization of process. There's always a right way to do things, don't question it, comply with the process. We know how it should be done. Hierarchy of power. There's nothing we like more than to report into a boss and to follow instructions, or to be the person giving the instructions. We are, as a species, hierarchical. That's how we operated for 2 million years when we were hunter-gatherers. So don't try and go against genetic nature. Planning of outcomes. Of course we have to work out how we're going to accomplish the task before we know the future. We have to think ahead. We have to plan. And finally, everyone can be bought by money. It's the most important thing in life. There are no other devices more motivating or incentivizing than money. If it takes a lot of money to bribe someone to do something you want them to do, then keep on bribing them. Okay, that's management. And I call it the 6 Bs. In business, we have to have checklists that all begin with the same letter. This slide took 2 years of constant thought to construct. Unity of purpose, the big, hairy, audacious goals, okay? Specialization of tasks, the box in which we sit, the one-person-sized box. Standardization of process, the bureaucracy we're putting in place. Plans, budgets, financial incentives, bonuses, hierarchy, bosses. But there's a dark side. Unity of purpose can be so constraining, so limiting in terms of what we see, what we notice, where we try and make a difference, that we miss things happening just beyond the margins of our line of sight. Specialization creates silos. What are jobs but micro silos? Standardization encourages groupthink, not challenging the standard way of doing things. Hierarchy instills fear. Planning promotes a compliant culture. Yes, sir. And incentives breed a kind of cynicism. I've been bought, I've been bribed. I'm not coming to work to do a good job. I'm lazy. I'm idle. If I could get away with it, I'd steal from the company. I certainly wouldn't put my back into anything. I'm a feckless human being that has no interest in doing anything either for myself or for others. Only if you keep paying me money will I reluctantly do what you want me to do. What a dreadful view of human beings that is. That people don't have a natural desire to do well and to help others and to make a better world. The alternative principles, instead of focus, serendipity, bumping into success, a level of accident and chance, expanding oneself, not being limited by a particular purpose, serving many purposes, going beyond the purpose, reframing the purpose, rather than one person accountable for a particular job through a job description, use the intelligence of the collective, sometimes called the wisdom of the crowd. Instead of standardization, why not permanent experimentation? Keep trying things out. The old way may be the wrong way, or a fallible way. Instead of hierarchy, why not put in some internal markets? Instead of planning, why not more opportunism? Where the world takes us by surprise, we see things. We can alight on those opportunities as they come up. Instead of incentives, ways of drawing upon people's intrinsic desire to do well and to be engaged. And then some examples. Gore-Tex. Frame your own purpose as an employee. You're a leader in, this is not Gore-Tex, this is W.L. Gore, the manufacturers of Gore-Tex fabric. It's a spin-off from DuPont, chemical company, 50 years old now. You're a leader if people come to your meetings. In other words, if you've got an idea and people find it exciting, they will choose to follow you. So it's a natural marketed leadership. Everyone is encouraged to come up with business ideas. Everyone is encouraged to take an initiative, to spend the company's money as they think they see fit. And others who find those individuals and ideas exciting will follow them. You're not appointed to be a leader, you're discovered by followers. So it's like a completely open marketed leadership. In W.L. Gore, you pay yourself what you think you're worth, so you set your own salary. No one in W.L. Gore can instruct anyone to do anything. It's a purely discretionary culture where people do what they want to do. Incredibly successful, by the way. Incredibly successful. It's a completely trusting. They vote for the CEO. I met her the other day. She gave a talk. Of course, do you think people pay themselves more or less, given that they can pay themselves what they want? Less, because they have to post the salary that they've awarded themselves. Everyone knows what everyone earns. So the pressure there, not to be too full of yourself. When you see others whom you admire immensely paying themselves 50,000, you're not to go in with 120,000 if you think they're better than you. There's a slight downward pressure on salaries. There's a restaurant near my place in North London in Hampstead. There probably are in Sydney restaurants that don't have prices. They simply say, pay us what you think the meal is worth. The Hampstead restaurant feels that people pay 20% more than they dare put as a price on a menu. And this company, Granite Rock, a nice example of experimentation. Small company, road making materials, chip limestone, asphalt, sand, gravel, and so on, cement. Small company, family owned, two brothers. Brothers went to Harvard on a business school course, discovered that customer service was a good idea. Came back and think, now how do we build customer service into our organization? They thought of sending them on courses, but they thought the better of that. And they thought, well, all we'll do is on the invoice to a customer, we'll invite the customer, if they're at all dissatisfied with any of the lines of service on the invoice, to scratch them out and only pay the balance, those things that they believe were done well. But please explain what we did that upset you on the things you scratched out. They're the smallest company. Within 2 years, they'd won the Baldrige Award, which is the top US award for quality. Smallest company ever to win it. And they charge on what is effectively a commodity product. They have a 3% price premium. Imagine if you're part of a team delivering sand to a particular chantier, particular project, you're not going to risk the company's cash flow on the basis of doing a shoddy job. You set really high standards for yourself, knowing that you'll be paid what the customer thinks you're worth. Collective intelligence, this is wisdom of the crowd. Best Buy, huge electronic retailer in North America. Very important, I suppose, if you're a retailer, to forecast sales, peak periods on critical items in the store. They employed a team of very, very expensive econometricians to make these forecasts. And they were, if I remember right, 95% accurate. And Gary Hamel was working with them and said, I think if we invite every employee of Best Buy to guess the sales of these items, and we take the average of all 80,000 employees, they might do better than the 6 econometricians. They did. I think they got 98.5% accurate. No conferring. The employees couldn't talk with one another and come to a considered view. They voted individually on where they thought the sales levels would be and took the average. Lots of examples. I mean, this is a different Best Buy, Procter & Gamble's Connect and Develop, where they put out 50% of their R&D to gifted thinkers and scientists and technologists outside, non-employees of P&G, to work on P&G issues. We did this with Roche, where Roche had a particular problem with one of the molecules they were developing for one of their drugs. And we encouraged them to send an email to all 3,800 scientists in their R&D labs around the world. It's the largest R&D group of any company in the world, 3,800. So they specified the question in a beautifully written email, pleading for answers, very, very important issue, sent to 3,800. And they also put it on the net, the same question, framed in the same way, on the net through a particular portal called Innocentive, which offers a small prize for any scientist working for free, nothing to do with Roche, answering the same question. How many answers do you think they got from their 3,800 scientists? Yeah, a dozen. Any good? One was quite good. One was a paragraph, a sort of glimmer of a thought. How many answers on the net? 150. Could have been 1,000. It was more complex than that, but you're on the right lines, I think. One of them was a 50-page monograph that solved the problem. What would you say? When does it exhaust itself or flow into standard thinking? What's the danger here?
When your competitors do it.
In a sense, when your competitors do it, yeah. Because in a sense, it's part of uncommon sense becoming common sense. When everyone's experimenting, then capitalism has to invent, and I mean, these slides will be redundant in, let's say, if they're not already redundant, or any idea that has merit is taken up by everybody, it loses its value. You still might want to do it, but it becomes part of the autonomic system of the firm. And then the bar is raised again, and you have to think of new ways of differentiating yourselves from competitors. That's the fun of capitalism, I think, that it's a permanent form of learning. The only real source of advantage is learning faster than your competitors. You're acquiring uncommon sense at a slightly higher pace than your competitors. It doesn't need to be brilliant. All it needs is like with a friend running from a tiger. You only have to run faster than your friend. You only have to run faster. You only have to learn faster than your competitors. There isn't some golden mean that you have to beat or exceed. It's just running faster, learning faster than your competitors. But I think you're right that, in a sense, this can become exhausted. The quality of the hypotheses becomes stale. The imagination runs out. Everyone's doing it. I think the problem is, the problem is that if we institute a change, we want it to be corporate-wide right at the beginning rather than defining it in one tiny. I mean, the Roche experiments that we're running with them are always in a tiny part of the business. So with the sales forces where we divided, they were all bonused up to the hilt with quotas and various incentive plans and so on. It was only one small sales force. We split it into two. Half we left with those bonuses, and the other half we took all that stuff away, and we said to them, simply do the best you can in the way you think would be best. And the latter, do the best you can, within a quarter was 23% ahead on sales from those who were bogged down in quotas and exponential incentives. It's a very good question. It's not always the middles. The middles may be like that because they're emulating the seniors, or it may be that they're desperate to try braver things but find resistance from seniors who either would like to do it themselves and don't want them tinkering with the model, or are truly frightened of what could come about. With Happy Computers, which I talked about, Henry, with one initiative, he gave pre-approval rights to 6 young teams who were allowed to come up with something fresh within the business that would take it to the next level. And when he heard giving pre-approval rights, he hadn't the right to say no. If they wanted to do it with his money, because it's a private company, they could. And when they presented, there was one good idea. He said, gosh, I wish I'd have thought of that, it's brilliant. But the other 5 were truly horrendous. He thought they were foolish, he thought they were reckless, and was genuinely convinced that it would bankrupt his business. But having given pre-approval rights, he gave them permission to go ahead. 5 of them were tremendously successful, the ones he was frightened of. The only duff one in the pack was the one he'd wished he'd thought of himself. Yeah, well he's attributing to the shareholders their unwillingness to take such risk. It's not obviously the case that the shareholders themselves would say, don't do that with our money. Because there is a difference. The CEO's entire reputation and career is bound up in that particular business. For the shareholders, their portfolio probably extends to, I don't know, 550 other businesses. So once, even if it's a major decision that goes wrong in one, it hardly influences the fund. There'll be somebody else in the sample who's done an extraordinary thing. But for the manager, the CEO, that's potentially life-threatening, isn't it, if you see what I mean? I don't know about where the blockers lie, really. I mean, I'm sure that the blockers to experimentation are perfectly rational in their own world, that people, given their beliefs, feel that it's not in their interest, or indeed in the interests of the firm, to do this stuff. And sometimes they may be right, but I'm as sure as anything that sometimes we are too risk averse. And I'm not sure what the model is. I mean, this would be a very interesting question. Perhaps it's the questions underlying these questions that need to be asked and answered in different ways. I like the phrase, and this is where we end, I'm afraid. I like the phrase, we dream vaguely, but we dread precisely. And that's part of the reason why we're more cautious than we could or should be. Thank you for your attention. I hope it was a useful 2 hours. Any thoughts you have, you can bang off an email. I'd like to hear anything you have to say. Please buy the book. It's selling so badly. We need the sales.